Vikings were never who you thought they were, but where did they come from? When you think of Vikings, what comes to mind? Horned helmets? Fierce warriors? Scandinavian legends? Well, what if I told you that their true origin is still a mystery? Today, we're diving deep into the untold story of where the Vikings really came from, and why nobody knows for sure. If you love history, mysteries, and forgotten stories, hit that subscribe button. Let's uncover the truth. When most people hear the word Viking, a specific image usually springs to mind: tall, rugged warriors with horned helmets, long beards, fur-lined clothing, and fierce eyes that suggest they're ready to pillage a village at any moment. This powerful and enduring stereotype has been shaped by centuries of storytelling, myths, art, and more recently, Hollywood films and TV shows. But how accurate is this image, and where did it actually come from? The truth is that our modern-day perception of the Viking is more legend than fact. While it's rooted in some historical truths, it's also heavily influenced by 19th-century Romanticism and modern media interpretations. For example, the horned helmet, arguably the most iconic Viking symbol, was never actually worn in battle. Historians and archaeologists have never discovered a single authentic Viking helmet with horns. That particular feature was popularized in the 1800s by costume designers for Wagnerian operas and has stuck ever since. In reality, Viking warriors likely wore simpler, more practical helmets made of iron or leather, often with a nose guard and without any dramatic embellishments. Their clothing would have been suited to the harsh Scandinavian climate: woolen tunics, cloaks, and trousers, sometimes fastened with brooches or belts. Far from being the chaotic barbarians they're often portrayed as, many Vikings were skilled craftspeople, farmers, traders, and seafarers. The historical period we refer to as the Viking Age spans roughly from 793 AD to 1066 AD. It begins with a dramatic and bloody event, the raid on the Lindisfarne Monastery on the northeastern coast of England in 793. This attack shocked the Christian world and signaled the beginning of the Viking raids that would leave an indelible mark on European history. It wasn't just the violence of the assault that caused alarm. It was also the sudden appearance of fast, shallow-draft ships crewed by unknown seafarers from the north. From that point onward, Viking activity increased rapidly. Over the next few centuries, Vikings would raid, trade, and settle across vast swaths of Europe, from the British Isles to the Frankish kingdoms, from the Iberian coast to Russia, and even as far as North Africa and the Middle East. The end of the Viking Age is typically marked by the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, when the English King Harold Godwin's son defeated the Norwegian King Harald Hardrada. Ironically, just weeks later, Harold himself would be defeated by William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings, ushering in a new era of Norman rule. This roughly 270-year span saw the rise and fall of Viking power and influence, but their legacy lives on far beyond that. Though Viking culture had widespread influence, its origins lie firmly in Scandinavia, specifically the regions we now know as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. These lands, characterized by fjords, forests, and a harsh climate, shaped the resilience and ingenuity of the people who lived there. It's important to understand that Viking was not a nationality but rather an activity or lifestyle. The term Viking is believed to have been a verb in Old Norse, Vikingr, meaning to go on an expedition or raid. Thus, not all Scandinavians were Vikings, but those who went Viking were often younger men seeking wealth, land, or adventure. Economic pressures, population growth, and limited arable land in Scandinavia may have pushed many to seek opportunities abroad. But their ventures weren't solely violent. The same people who raided monasteries and cities also established trade routes and settlements that spanned from Greenland to Constantinople. Each Scandinavian region had its own style and emphasis. The Danes tended to focus on raids and settlements in England and France. The Norwegians explored westward, reaching Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, and even North America, Vinland. The Swedes, meanwhile, turned eastward, navigating the rivers of modern-day Russia and Ukraine and establishing trade networks with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphates. At the heart of Viking life was a warrior ethos. Strength, bravery, and loyalty were deeply valued, and these values were immortalized in the Norse sagas and poems passed down orally across generations. Battles were not only a means of acquiring wealth or territory. They were also seen as a test of honor. Dying heroically in battle was one of the surest ways to reach Valhalla, the mythological hall of slain warriors where they would feast and fight until the end of the world. But the Vikings weren't just brutal warriors, they were also among the most advanced navigators and shipbuilders of their time. Their longships were technological marvels, long, narrow vessels with symmetrical bows that allowed for quick turning, and shallow drafts that enabled travel in both open sea and shallow rivers. These ships allowed them to strike swiftly and retreat just as quickly, which often left terrified communities with little time to mount a defense. The same ships used for raids were also used for exploration and trade. The Vikings were constantly on the move, not just to pillage, but to discover. They founded settlements in remote areas, including the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Greenland. Most famously, around the year 1000 AD, Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, is believed to have reached the shores of what is now Newfoundland in Canada, making the Vikings the first Europeans to set foot in North America, nearly 500 years before Columbus. Beyond warfare and exploration, Viking society was surprisingly complex and structured. They had laws, assemblies known as things, and even democratic practices where free men could vote on community decisions. Women in Viking society also held more rights than in many other parts of medieval Europe, with some even participating in battle or owning property. While the popular image of the Viking is often shaped by legend, television, and folklore, historians and archaeologists have been digging, quite literally, into the facts. Over the last 2 centuries, thousands of discoveries across Scandinavia and other parts of Europe have helped paint a clearer, though still incomplete, picture of Viking life, society, and culture. From runestones and burial mounds to ancient tools, ships, and dwellings, the archaeological record tells a powerful story about who the Vikings were, and who they may have descended from. One of the most iconic remnants of Viking civilization is the runestone. These tall, upright stones, carved with runic inscriptions, were often erected as memorials to deceased family members or as declarations of power and territory. Found across Scandinavia, especially in Sweden, these stones offer valuable insights into the language, religion, and social structure of the Viking Age. Some runestones even mention distant expeditions, battles, or voyages, highlighting just how interconnected the Viking world was. Runes themselves were part of a writing system known as the Futhark, named after the first 6 letters of the runic alphabet. Unlike Latin scripts, runes were angular, likely designed for carving into wood or stone. While not all Vikings were literate, runic inscriptions were used widely enough to suggest a strong cultural attachment to writing, especially for honoring the dead and marking significant achievements. In addition to runestones, Viking burial sites have provided critical information about their beliefs and way of life. The Vikings practiced both cremation and inhumation, burial, often including grave goods such as weapons, tools, jewelry, and sometimes even animals or ships. These grave goods reflected the status and role of the deceased, as well as the Viking belief in an afterlife. Warriors were frequently buried with swords and shields, while women were often interred with brooches, beads, spinning tools, and sometimes keys, which symbolized their role as household keepers. The most famous example is the Oseberg ship burial discovered in Norway in 1904. This elaborately carved longship, dating back to the early 9th century, contained the remains of 2 high-status women, along with richly decorated items including wooden carvings, textiles, sleds, and even a wagon. The site revealed not only the craftsmanship of the Vikings but also their social stratification and spiritual practices. Tools, combs, coins, and weapons found across Europe, sometimes as far as Russia and the Middle East, indicate that Vikings were not only raiders but also traders and craftsmen. Their artifacts have been discovered in marketplaces, river ports, and settlements, attesting to a vast economic network that stretched far beyond the boundaries of Scandinavia. At the heart of Viking identity was their language, Old Norse. Spoken across the Scandinavian world, Old Norse was a North Germanic language that gave rise to modern Scandinavian tongues such as Norwegian, Swedish, Icelandic, and Danish. It also left a significant imprint on the English language, especially in areas of England where Vikings settled. Words like sky, egg, knife, window, and even the pronoun they have Norse origins. Old Norse wasn't just a tool for communication, it was a vehicle for culture. Through it, the Vikings shared poetry, mythology, and legal traditions. The Norse sagas, although written down centuries later in Iceland, are believed to preserve the oral storytelling traditions of the Viking Age. These tales feature gods like Odin, Thor, and Loki, epic sea voyages, feuds and heroism, and philosophical meditations on fate, honor, and death. Linguistically and culturally, the Vikings shared commonalities with other Germanic tribes. These included the Angles, Saxons, and Goths, who had earlier migrated across Europe during the decline of the Roman Empire. The Vikings, however, maintained a distinct identity shaped by their northern environment, their seafaring expertise, and their decentralized political structure. Their cultural practices also emphasized individual freedom and local governance. Rather than kings and emperors, early Viking societies were organized around chieftains and local assemblies, called things. These gatherings served as both courts and parliaments, where free men could speak, resolve disputes, and make decisions. This democratic tradition set the Vikings apart from many of the monarchic systems in medieval Europe. To understand the Vikings fully, we must look beyond the Viking Age itself and into their prehistoric roots. Long before the first longship set sail, the lands of Scandinavia were inhabited by peoples whose cultures laid the groundwork for what would later become Viking society. The Nordic Bronze Age, approximately 1700 to 500 BC, saw the rise of a sophisticated culture centered around metalworking, agriculture, and long-distance trade. Artifacts from this period include bronze swords, laws, curved musical instruments, and sun chariots, which reflect a deep spiritual connection to nature and cosmology. Petroglyphs carved into rock faces depict ships, warriors, animals, and rituals, echoes of themes that would resurface in Viking iconography. Following the Bronze Age came the Pre-Roman and Roman Iron Age, 500 BC to 400 AD, during which Scandinavian tribes began to adopt iron tools and weapons, build more permanent settlements, and engage in growing contact with the Roman world. Though they never became part of the Roman Empire, the tribes of the north were well aware of its influence. Roman coins and goods have been found in Scandinavian sites, suggesting trade routes or mercenary service. By the migration period, 400 to 800 AD, many Germanic tribes were on the move throughout Europe. While some left Scandinavia to form new kingdoms, like the Goths and Lombards, others stayed and continued developing unique regional identities. These people, hardened by isolation and shaped by their environment, would eventually evolve into the seafaring societies we now associate with the Vikings. In this way, the Vikings did not emerge from nowhere, they were the heirs of centuries of cultural evolution. The transition from Bronze Age to Iron Age, from scattered tribes to organized chieftains, and from oral traditions to written inscriptions reveals a long and complex path leading to the Viking Age. For all that historians and archaeologists have uncovered about the Vikings, their ships, their settlements, their language, and their legends, one of the biggest questions remains unanswered: where did the first Vikings come from? The deeper we dig into their past, the clearer it becomes that the origins of the Vikings are anything but straightforward. And while we know where Viking culture flourished during the Viking Age, the roots of that culture stretch into a hazy past that no one fully understands. Despite their tremendous impact on European history, the earliest origins of the Vikings remain elusive. What we think of as Viking culture didn't suddenly appear in 793 AD with the raid on Lindisfarne. Rather, it developed over generations from the customs, technologies, and spiritual beliefs of earlier Scandinavian societies. But tracing this development is no easy task. The problem begins with the absence of written records. Unlike the Romans, Greeks, or Egyptians, the early Scandinavians didn't keep historical accounts in a structured, chronological form. The Vikings only began using runes to write inscriptions a few centuries before the Viking Age, and even then, their usage was limited to short phrases carved into stones or wooden objects, mostly names, dedications, or commemorations. These inscriptions are invaluable, but they don't provide detailed historical narratives. So when it comes to piecing together the origins of Viking society, historians are left to rely on archaeological evidence and, crucially, the Norse sagas, but the latter come with significant caveats. The Icelandic sagas, perhaps the most famous literary legacy of the Norse world, are often cited in discussions about Viking culture and history. These stories are filled with grand adventures, heroic battles, family feuds, voyages across unknown seas, and interactions with gods and mythical creatures. They give us colorful, vivid portraits of what Viking life may have looked like, but there's a major problem: they were written centuries after the Viking Age ended. Most sagas were composed in the 13th and 14th centuries, long after the last Viking longship had sailed. By that time, Christianity had already replaced the Old Norse religion, and Icelandic society had changed significantly. As a result, the sagas are highly stylized works of literature, blending history with myth, and often shaped by political and religious agendas. While they likely contain kernels of truth and preserve valuable cultural memories, the sagas can't be treated as literal historical documents. They reflect how medieval Norse writers viewed their ancestors, not necessarily how those ancestors lived. This complicates our understanding of Viking origins. Are the stories of Odin's wanderings, the discovery of distant lands, or the battles of legendary chieftains based on real events, or are they allegorical tales meant to inspire or entertain? The line between fact and fiction is blurry. And in the case of the Vikings, it's often impossible to separate them cleanly. To further complicate things, some researchers believe that the Viking story began well before Scandinavia was even fully formed into distinct tribal groups. There are various migration theories suggesting that the people who would become the Vikings may have originally come from much farther east or south. One fascinating theory proposes that Scandinavia was influenced by groups migrating from the Eurasian steppe, particularly from the regions around the Black Sea or Central Asia. These regions were home to nomadic tribes like the Scythians and Sarmatians, who shared certain characteristics with early Germanic and Nordic peoples, such as warrior cultures, horse-based mobility, and ritualistic burials. Some scholars argue that these tribes may have intermingled with Northern Europeans, bringing with them new technologies, spiritual ideas, and social structures. Others point to the Pontic-Caspian steppe as a possible ancestral home for some of the peoples who would later settle in Northern Europe. Genetic and archaeological links have shown that there was movement of populations across these vast territories thousands of years before the Viking Age. Over time, these groups may have migrated northward, eventually adapting to the colder climates of the Scandinavian peninsula. While none of these theories are conclusive, they suggest that the Viking identity was not born in isolation. Rather, it may have emerged from a complex web of cultural exchanges, migrations, and integrations across Eurasia. This would help explain the genetic diversity found among Viking Age skeletons in recent DNA studies, which reveal traces of not only Scandinavian ancestry, but also Slavic, Baltic, and even Middle Eastern lineages. In recent years, cutting-edge DNA analysis has added a new layer to this mystery. In 2020, researchers analyzed the genomes of over 400 Viking-era skeletons from burial sites across Europe. The results were surprising. Many individuals identified as Vikings did not have purely Scandinavian ancestry. Some had genetic markers linked to Southern Europe, while others were more closely related to populations from the British Isles or Eastern Europe. This suggests that being a Viking was less about where you were from and more about what you did. Vikingness was, in many cases, a lifestyle, a cultural affiliation tied to seafaring, raiding, trading, and settlement. People across Europe could become Vikings, regardless of their ancestry. This further muddies the waters when trying to define who the original Vikings truly were. In essence, we may never be able to draw a single straight line tracing the Viking identity back to one place or time. Their origins are multifaceted, entangled, and possibly unknowable. In many Viking settlements across Europe, from Dublin to York to Normandy, you see the same pattern: Norse newcomers intermingling with locals, adopting local customs, languages, and even clothing styles. Over time, the line between Viking and native blurred, creating new, hybrid identities. Even within Scandinavia itself, the Viking Age was marked by mobility and diversity. Merchants traveled to the Middle East, bringing back silk, silver, and spices. Warriors fought as mercenaries in foreign courts. Craftsmen and blacksmiths incorporated techniques learned from distant lands. The Viking world was more globalized than most people imagine. Viking culture spread not just through conquest, but also through exchange, both violent and peaceful. As Vikings expanded their reach across Europe and beyond, they absorbed elements from the cultures they encountered. This created a dynamic fusion of ideas, languages, technologies, and belief systems. Through trade, Vikings established economic connections from the North Sea to the Caspian Sea. Archaeological finds have uncovered Arabic coins in Sweden, Buddhist statues in Viking hordes, and even Chinese silk in Iceland. These discoveries demonstrate the vast reach of Viking trade networks and their openness to foreign goods and influences. Through war, Vikings exerted their power across wide regions, but they also settled in the places they conquered. In places like England, Ireland, and France, they didn't just raid, they stayed. They married local women, raised families, and formed new political entities. The Normans, who would later conquer England in 1066, were descendants of Viking settlers in France who had adopted the French language and Christian religion. And through exploration, Vikings brought their culture to new frontiers. In Iceland, Greenland, and even Vinland, believed to be in present-day Newfoundland, they established outposts far from home. These colonies adapted to local conditions while maintaining core elements of Norse culture. This constant blending of cultures is a defining feature of Viking identity. Rather than resisting foreign influence, Vikings often embraced it, adapting it into their own way of life. This flexibility and openness may have been one of their greatest strengths, and one of the reasons Viking culture spread so widely and endured so long. In today's world, where identity is often viewed through rigid categories, race, nationality, religion, the Vikings offer a striking contrast. Their identity was practical, adaptable, and open to change. You didn't have to be born in Scandinavia to be a Viking. You just had to join the journey, whether that meant sailing across the sea, setting up a market stall in a foreign land, or fighting in a distant army. In this sense, the Vikings weren't just people of the North, they were people of movement, of ambition, and of curiosity. Their cultural identity was defined not by where they came from, but by what they chose to do. In the end, the Viking story isn't just about where they came from, it's about how far they went. Across oceans, across cultures, and even across time. If you found this journey through history as fascinating as I did, give it a thumbs up, share it with someone who loves unraveling ancient mysteries, and let me know in the comments, where do you think the Vikings truly came from? And if you're into lost origins, hidden truths, and deep dives into the past, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. There's so much more history waiting to be